The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
A very good evening to you all, and welcome to our 5th week of the SyntroP Wellbeing series. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome. My name is Zoraida Jardine, and I will be your host for this evening. And if you are returning, it's so good to have you back with us again. So tonight is it's another special topic for me. So was last week with breathwork therapy, because it's a big part of my personal practice. And today we're going to be touching on a paradigm which I feel is changing the healthcare industry, and that is functional medicine, health and well-being. And tonight we are speaking to the brainchild behind the SyntroP Wellbeing series, as well as specialist cardiologist Dr. Riaz Mutara. Welcome, Dr. Riaz.
Good evening, Zoraida, and thank you very much for having me this evening.
You're looking very dapper tonight, I have to say.
It's cold in Johannesburg, so I've had to wear my jacket and a jersey.
So, Doctor, I would love, the first time I met you, which was a couple of months ago, you shared your personal story with me in terms of being a practitioner and the transition from where you were initially a couple of decades ago to how you practice today. Do you mind talking us through that, if you don't mind? Because I found it incredibly interesting.
Yeah, so I trained as a cardiologist almost 20 years ago and went into private practice. And I think within 2 years of being in private practice, although I enjoyed being with my patients, I felt something was missing. I was treating my patients with heart attacks and high blood pressure and diabetes and so on. But they just never seemed to get better. They would always come back a month later and say to me, well, I'm tired, I've got a headache, I can't lose weight. And in my mind, I would think, well, maybe you should just not eat too much, And this is how we were trained. And I felt something was missing. And I spoke to an endocrinologist friend of mine, who then introduced me to the whole concept of functional medicine. And that got me on this amazing journey over the past 18 years to be able to look at patients very differently when they come to see me. We were trained to treat patients, or we were trained as organ specialists. So all I saw was your heart, and I didn't see you. And I think, that's probably part of the deficiency of our training for many doctors and many specialists, is that we see you as a brain or a kidney or a heart or a liver, and we don't see you as a holistic being. And for me, functional medicine gave me the outlet or the opportunity to be able to look at you a little bit more holistically, understand what was going on in your environment, and what were the stressors in your environment that were contributing to you being unwell.
Okay, wow. I love that. And I do agree with you. The concept of academia and the way we work is still very much set in a very archaic paradigm. When we look at today's day and world, where I would think that we are transitioning to a space where, especially when it comes to healthcare, that we are becoming more preventative, right, as opposed to reactive. And so that becomes paramount in today's day and age, to treat someone with a tailor-made approach as opposed to a one-size-fits-all.
So that's correct. I think if you look at the way we were all trained as doctors, societies published best practice guidelines, and we are expected to treat all the patients that arrive in our rooms based on those best practice guidelines in the same way. But we are all individuals, and each patient has a unique set of symptoms, a unique set of signs, unique stressors in their environment, and they all present differently. So you can't look at a guideline that has been published. You can look at it purely as a guideline, but to guide you in a particular direction. But each patient needs to be looked at as an individual And the approach to diagnosing and treating our patients needs to be personalized. And you're right, I think that's where medicine is going. I think it will become more and more personalized as we have access to newer technologies and newer therapies and newer ways of diagnosing illness, that it will become more and more personalized and predictive.
Yeah. So, doctor, I know that you are very much one of those doctors that are addressing the why question in terms of illness, as opposed to, the symptoms and the plaster on. How has that changed for you in terms of the reception you're getting from your patients now, as opposed to 15, 20 years ago?
So many patients that come to see me, now, when they leave, they have a greater understanding of why they fell ill in the first place. So it's not just about the prescription. I mean, that's an important component to managing patients, but it's not entirely where patients came to see us in the past. They gave us their signs and their symptoms. We tried to make a diagnosis as best as we could. We looked at their blood results, and then we sent them off on their merry way with a prescription. And we hoped for the best. So I'm not saying medication is necessarily bad or wrong. I'm saying that medication is an important component of well-being or getting you better. But we also need to look at your overall well-being. What about lifestyle that plays a crucial role? What about newer concepts in terms of diet? What types of exercise are important? What about the role of supplementation in a modern world? And how do complementary therapies aid in your well-being? Now, if you go to some of the top hospitals in America, like the Cleveland Clinic and the Mayo Clinic, these are really premier institutes in the world, and they offer their patients every conceivable therapy or option of therapy that their patients may be interested in. So if you want to have reflexology at the Mayo Clinic, you can. If you'd like to see a homeopath at the Cleveland Clinic, you can. Whereas locally in South Africa, at our hospitals, it's purely focused on academic medicine and on sorting out an acute problem, which is necessary. But I think we then forget about the patients in that interim period of when they're being discharged before they come back to see us in 6 months' time. There's not enough patient engagement. There's not enough support for patients on that lifestyle journey. And that is why many patients fall off, that train, and then they get ill again, and then they get admitted again, and the whole cycle is then repeated. So what we do now, or the way we treat patients, is not necessarily new. All of it is scientifically validated. It's just taking all the information that we have and putting it together into a nice, concise way and getting everything to converge in a way that we're able to look at the patient as a total being rather than just an organ.
And that's so incredibly empowering. I was about to say, particularly in a country like South Africa that has such a diverse population, but the truth is that human beings are diverse, regardless of where you go globally. And if you look at South Africa, 70 to 80%, I'd even say maybe 90% of our population would, for example, turn to traditional medicine before they turn to a biomedical doctor. And sometimes there's that fear of saying that you go to a traditional doctor, because I find that we're not working in tandem together. And to give a patient or a human being rather the choice to go, okay, this is what you're going to get, but tell me what appeals to you. And as with breathwork therapy, which we addressed last week with Dr. Ila Manga, just that in itself is being scientifically proven. And if you look at breathwork therapy, it's an old traditional philosophy way of healing, from the San here in Africa to, pranayama and the chi and the ki. It's so lovely that those organizations offer that. And in terms of that, I'd like to commend you on what you're doing in your very beautiful space called the Sanctuary. you're starting to do that too, which is incredible. I want to ask you about something that you mentioned earlier on called environmental determinants. Can you elaborate on that and what that actually means in terms of triggers?
Right. So I'm going to put up a slide, Zoraida, to try, and I don't have too many slides this evening, but I'm going to try to get everybody to understand this continuum of how does it all start. By the time you present with a sign and symptom, it's already late in the entire process. So what I'd like to do is take everybody through a short little journey in terms of the continuum of how we get ill and how it all fits together. Now, there are three major pillars that contribute to the way or what happens to us physically. The first one being something called inflammation, which everybody's heard a lot about now in recent times in relation to COVID-19. The second pillar that I will take you through is something called autonomic dysregulation, which is our nervous system. And then the third component are the hormonal imbalances that we get that make us unwell. And you may have either one of these pillars or all three pillars at the same time when we get ill. So let me start in the beginning. Okay? It all depends what we get exposed to in our environment. So from the diet that we consume, or these days what we are not really getting in our diet in terms of adequate nutrition. There's the toxins or pollutants that we get exposed to. There's environmental and work-related stress and where we live. There's acute and chronic infections that we get exposed to throughout our lifetime. And by far the commonest reason of why we become unwell today is related to emotional traumas or emotional stressors that we experience from time to time, and nobody has really given us a means of dealing with these emotional traumas. Now, what we get exposed to in our environment may then lead to any one of these or all of these three pillars. So let's talk about the first one called inflammation. Now, as you know, inflammation may either be acute or it may be chronic. So acute inflammation is like when you get a COVID-19 infection and you are really sick and you are in hospital, and that acute inflammatory response may make us ill. So that type of inflammation needs to be treated and needs to be managed in order for you to get well. So it's a pneumonia, it's a urine infection, it's a meningitis, it's a COVID-19 cytokine storm in our body. That's an example of acute inflammation. But many of us suffer from something called chronic low-grade inflammation. So if you're eating a diet that's rich in omega-6 and low in omega-3, as an example, if we're consuming too much refined sugar and starch, if we're eating micronutrient deficient fruit and vegetables, okay, all of these factors contribute to us developing this low-grade but chronic long-term inflammation in our body. And in the same way that the body attempts to heal you and protect you during acute inflammation, it tries to do that with chronic inflammation. So many of the conditions that we suffer from is actually the healing response gone wrong over many years. Okay? So that's the problem with inflammation, and we'll come back to what we can do about that a little bit later. The second one that I'd like to talk about are the hormonal imbalances, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because there's so much to talk about under this topic. But simple things like an underactive thyroid, insulin resistance or having too much insulin in our body, low testosterone levels in men, menopause, all of these types of hormonal imbalances may then also affect what happens to us from a point of a chronic disease, of developing chronic disease. The one I'd like to focus on tonight is really something that nobody really talks about much. We've known about it for many, many years, but people don't really talk about it much. And that's something called autonomic dysregulation. Now, it's a long word. Let me try and simplify that for you. So if you look at our nervous system within our body, it's made up of two big parts. The first part is the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spinal cord. And then the second part of your nervous system are the peripheral nerves that leave our spine and go everywhere to make us move our hands and our toes and so on. And the second component of the peripheral nervous system is something called the autonomic nervous system. And it's called that because it is automatic in nature. So this is the nervous system that would control our heart rate, how fast and how slow we breathe, how our bowel functions, how much hormone thyroid gland may release. So this is not necessarily under our direct conscious control. It's happening in the background. And this autonomic nervous system is crucial to our survival. And it's made up of two parts that we call the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system is your stress system. That's like when you see a snake, and you get a shock, or a lion is about to pounce on you, or you, God forbid, are getting hijacked, or something like that acute. That's the massive release of adrenaline into our system that's actually designed to save our life. The parasympathetic nervous system is your anti-stress system. Okay? And this is your what we would call your rest and your relax system. This is the system that balances out your sympathetic nervous system. Okay? It gets you, this is 30 minutes after a bungee jump, as an example. And these two nervous systems in our body have to be balanced in order for our body to function in an optimal way, or for the cells to function in a happy environment. Now, when you take the inflammation and or the autonomic dysfunction and or the hormonal imbalances, okay, these three major pillars may influence little light switches in our DNA that we refer to as epigenetic phenomena. Now, there you go. That's another long term, right? So to simplify our genes and to understand it, as humans, we roughly have 24,000 genes in our genome or in our DNA. And each gene doesn't give you a particular physical effect, like blue eyes or green eyes or small toes or big ears and so on. Each gene can give us up to 2,000 possible effects. So that's 24,000 to the power of 2,000. That's why we are all unique in a way. So although the DNA and the code stays the same from what we get from our parents, our genes are constantly in a state of flux because depending what we expose ourselves to in our environment, we may be switching on or switching off light switches at any point in our life. So you can switch on a light switch for cancer, you can switch off a light switch for cancer, and so on. And this is why what we expose ourselves to in our environment and what happens at a thought level is so absolutely crucial to what affects us in our lifetime. So you've got your environment, it affects any one or more of these three pillars. We get the imbalances in our body, that influences little light switches in our DNA, and then we get the disease or the illness, and we then become symptomatic. So as doctors, we tend to get you right down at the bottom of this entire process. Okay? And we're trying to make sense of why you got ill in the first place. And we don't spend necessarily enough time trying to figure out what in our environment is actually making us ill. Now, the body is remarkable in the sense that it can make you ill, but it can also make you well if you approach it in the right way. So that's just, I've tried to simplify it into one little slide that creates or makes it contextual for everybody to understand how we actually get ill in the first place.
Thank you for sharing that. I had my genes tested with D-analysis. In fact, just a little side note that my area may or may not be undergoing some some load shedding at 8 o'clock. And if I do go out, I've got Dr. Danny Meisfeld that will be standing by to take over. But I went and I had my genetics tested, and I found that incredibly interesting, you know, in terms of finding out or rather having that knowledge about what can be turned on or turned off. Because I, for example, have, you know, my father died of a heart attack, my mom died of a stroke. So I know that I'm kind of like predisposed to some genes, but I guess getting there would be dependent on what environment is like and how I'm reacting to that environment, right?
So that's right. So I think if you look at where it's all going, Zoraida, I think medicine will be mostly about genetics going forward. If we can understand which light switches are switched on at different points of our genes with specific diseases, that's ultimately where the cure will come for many of the things that affect us. So we never had the technology, or the systems were not in place, or the science was not there yet in terms of fully understanding how our genes work and how they contribute towards illness. And this changes on a day-to-day basis. There's newer markers and newer points of interest that come out every single day. So for us going forward as a species, if we can stay healthy long enough and look after ourselves, I think there's a very exciting future that awaits all of us in the field of genetics. I think it's still early, but I think we're moving very, very rapidly to get to that advanced knowledge and understanding of how our genes work and how they influence what happens to us physically in our body over time.
Thank you. I heard this great analogy, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but it's something about your genes are the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. Is that right, or something like that?
Yeah. So yes, that's correct. Okay. So you know, you could be sitting in front of a beautiful mountain and having a very special moment and having an immense feeling of gratitude in that moment, and that could be having a positive effect on your genes. You could be eating fast food every day, and that will have a negative influence on those light switches in our DNA. We get exposed to a major emotional trauma in our life, and we store that emotion at the level of our subconscious, and that can trigger a negative response in our genes. So it's not only about negative responses, we can also influence positive responses in our genes depending on what we eat, what we get exposed to, or emotional traumas we get exposed to, the types of infections that we get exposed to, whether we have a healthy gut microbiome or bacteria. And so there's so many factors, that external factors that could influence how our genes work and function.
Thank you, Doctor. Can you take me through, on your slide, you had toxins there. Can you take me through some external toxins which I believe are quite detrimental to our health and well-being, like mold, for example? How does that impact one's well-being? Like if you're living in a house that's moldy after years of actually not thinking that could be detrimental to your health.
So in the example that you give, Zoraida, when we live in a house or in a damp area and I get exposed to a lot of mold or fungus, we may breathe in those spores into our lungs. Okay, and our body then has to make sense of those spores in our lungs, and will try to heal you. So those spores would create inflammation. They would maybe affect our lungs in a particular way. They may cause other allergies. They may increase our risk of other diseases such as autoimmune diseases or allergies and so on. And our body will always try to attempt to heal that. Okay, so that's where the cause of, we were talking about chronic inflammation earlier. It's the same thing, for example, if you suffer with chronic gum disease or gingivitis. or bad hygiene in our mouth. That chronic inflammation may increase your risk of developing a heart attack or developing certain types of head and neck cancers. So any form of infection or chronic environmental stress that we place on the body will demand that the body attempts to heal it. And if we don't then address the cause of the problem, it's that healing response, as I said earlier, that goes wrong that actually makes us sick.
I actually wrote that down, the healing response gone wrong. And I love your consistently positive narrative that keeps going back to, the body wants to heal itself as well. And that's one of the things, the philosophies that I appreciate about functional medicine, is that it also looks at trying to find out what's right with you as opposed to what's wrong all the time. Doctor, I want to touch on emotional states and fear. So, it's all good and well to want to be positive, but what happens when you get information about your health and well-being that is not positive? How does one navigate that fear state?
So when we look at emotional trauma, as I said earlier, Zoraida, I mean, we are just exposed to so many emotional traumas right now in our lives, and it's not new. We've been exposed to various emotional traumas like death of a family member, divorce, financial problems, crime, relationship issues, and now we have COVID-19. And it's the direct emotional trauma of fear associated with getting the infection, but then also all the perceived fears of the future that may affect us. We're living now in times of greater uncertainty, greater fear. We're not sure what's going to happen financially to us. We have job insecurity. We're not sure what happens to our children, and so on. So people that I've seen recently, or patients that have come to see me, have so many different fears as a consequence of this crisis. And that perhaps maybe on a background of a lifetime of fears that we have been exposed to. And putting all of this fear together creates a massive response in our body, or demands a massive reaction to try and heal it. So what I'd like to perhaps do is maybe take people through my understanding of what is fear and why, how do we get affected by fear? Is it about getting rid of fear? Should we deny that fear exists? Should we be thinking positively only? And it's all of those, okay? So if I take you through how it all works, we know that there are two realms of perhaps maybe existence or consciousness that we would call the realm of the absolute and the realm of the relative. Now, in the realm of the absolute, that's what we call God, or people call it consciousness, or love, or unity, or oneness. Many people call it many different things depending on their religious and cultural belief system. Now, at that level where everything is unified and everything is one, there can be no experience. There is only knowledge or knowing of everything. So you can know hot and you can know cold, but you can't experience it. By definition, when we desire to have an experience of something, it has to be split into two. So if we go back to Newton's law, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. But what he failed to say in that law is that it happens simultaneously or almost immediately. So love couldn't exist as pure love in our existence as an experience. Love is split into two in the realm of the relative where we exist. Okay? So love is split into love and its opposite emotion called fear. So every time we have a desire to experience anything in our life, a new sports car, a holiday on an island, getting married, going to university, so many different things, any desire. In the instant that you desire it, the opposite fear is created. Okay, but that fear is actually an illusion, right? It doesn't really exist. So that fear is created as a reference point for you to know your desire, because you can't experience your desire in a vacuum. So let me give you an example. If you desire to feel hot, then cold has to exist somewhere in the universe to create context for experiencing hot, because you can't experience hot in a vacuum. And similarly, you can't experience up without down, or black without white, or white without black, and so on. Okay? So everything has its opposite in our existence. So at an emotional level, there are only two core emotions that we experience as human beings. You're either experiencing or coming from a point of love, or you're coming from a point of fear. And that is largely dependent on what you choose to feel. So that's where free will or free choice comes in. Okay? But we've had our 10,000 hours of being trained to always choose from a point of fear. So from the time we were little, our parents said, don't sit there, Zoraida, you're going to break your neck and you're going to fall. And then we went to school and our teacher said, well, if you don't do this, you're going to the principal's office. And the laws that we have devised as a species tells us, well, if you do that, you're going to jail. Or if you do that, we're going to cut your hand off, right? And our religions and our belief systems then also created this fear of the entire system. So we got our 10,000 hours to unconsciously or subconsciously always choose from a point of fear. So as an example, if you've won the lotto and you desire to buy this amazing new sports car, in the instant that you desire to buy that sports car, you're going to have the feeling of, well, what happens if the receiver of revenue contacts me? Oh, it's going to be too expensive to look after this car. Maybe somebody's going to hijack me in this car. So the system of manifestation or creation in the universe is exactly the same for everyone and in every instant. It doesn't fail. So you always get and always create what you choose. So Joe Dispenza, that many people know of, calls it and refers to it as the brain, okay, or thoughts are the vocabulary of the brain, and sensations and feelings are the vocabulary of your body. So you have a thought, and then it creates a certain sensation or feeling within our body. That sensation or feeling then creates another thought process. And this is what happens to us throughout the entire day, is that we're constantly moving between thought, sensation, and feeling, sensation, and thought, without actually observing our choices. Why do we make certain choices? So all other negative emotions, such as guilt, anger, shame, resentment, and feelings of loss, are actually just derivatives of a core fear. And also called positive emotions of joy and hope and empathy and so on are just derivatives of a core emotion that we call love. Now, ultimate acceptance means that you have to love every moment as pure perfection that arrives in your life, because only you have chosen it to be so. Now, we may choose individually, but we can also choose as a collective. And if the collective consciousness amongst all of us creates a big fear or greater fear with something like COVID, then it's easier to manifest that into our existence. It's how do you choose as an individual to respond to either your individual or this collective fear in your life. So acceptance means that you have to love every moment that arrives in our lives as absolute perfection. And when you're able to love your fear and give it a hug, as much as you're able to love the so-called positive in our life, it becomes easier to overcome this emotion called fear. So fear in effect is an illusion, as I said earlier. It's just the reference point for you to know your desires, because you cannot experience your desires or imagination or inspiration in a vacuum. Something has to create context, like everything else in this realm of the relative that we exist in. So it's sometimes not so easy to understand these concepts, but the more you train yourself to become an observer of your choices, and if you're not happy with the choice, then make a new choice. Okay? So there's no right or wrong in our choices. There's just merely consequences or outcomes of our choices. Okay? And if we can get ourselves to understand these concepts and stop beating ourselves up for when so-called negative things arrive in our life, okay, then it becomes easier to see what it is all about and get to that point of acceptance. So when we are exposed to massive amounts of fear, and that fear drives the stress hormones in our body, such as adrenaline and noradrenaline. And this chronic release of adrenaline and noradrenaline, like chronic inflammation does, then will influence little light switches in our DNA and cause the dis-ease. So often when we have these chronic fears and chronic sympathetic overdrive that I spoke about earlier, our anti-stress hormones are now low. And the major one that we talk about is something called cortisol, which is our natural cortisone that we have in our bodies. And when our cortisol levels are low, we tend to suffer with chronic fatigue in the late afternoons and evenings. We are irritable. We crave for chocolates or sweet things at night. You don't tolerate noise or bright lights very well. You have headaches, anxiety, dizziness, eczema, joint pains, dark rings around your eyes, and the list goes on and on, okay, depending on the severity. So it's absolutely crucial to understand that at a thought level, how we choose, okay, from a point of love or from a point of fear, and you cannot get rid of that fear. It's always there as a reference point. The trick in all of this is to observe it, of why it is there, and then choose, would I like to experience my fear, or would I actually like to experience my desire? Okay, and then move on to the next one and the next one. And then it becomes easier over time to almost subconsciously keep choosing what you wish to experience in your life. And that is why it appears that some people are able to manifest certain experiences faster in their life compared to other people. It's a simple process of learning how to observe your choices and making the choice that you wish to experience, or trying to get the outcome that you wish to experience. Okay.
Thank you. That was deeply, beautifully, radiantly profound. Thank you for that. So I'd like to ask you personally, when you receive information that is probably not the information that you want to receive, what is your behavioral pattern in terms of thought? Do you experience any form of feeling let down or sad or non-acceptance?
So most definitely, right? So we are human, and we always tend to fall back to what we have experienced in the past, and from what memories we have stored in the past. So we always react initially and instinctively in the same way that we've always done. So initially, yes, your heart rate goes up. You feel that tense sensation in your chest. You feel like the whole world is against you, and why have you not? Why has the world not manifested what you have desired? Okay. But the trick in it is that once you start observing these things, okay, and stepping back, take 3 deep breaths, observe why you feel the way that you do, or why you're reacting in the way. So if I take it back a step, because we've been trained for so many years to always choose our fear, we are always recreating or reenacting or responding to the same emotion of fear, different events, but the same emotion in exactly the same way. So if you do a little exercise in your life and go back as far as you can remember and ask yourself what happened at age 5 and 7 and 11 and so on in your life. Okay? And what were the linked emotions during that event? And then ask yourself, what did you think about? What did you talk about? And what decisions did you subsequently make in your life after that event? And write it down. And go to the next event and the next event. And what you will soon see is that it is the same response, the same reenactment, okay, to the same emotion. They're different events, but the underlying process is exactly the same. So what I'm able to do these days a lot easier is that it's shorter now. It's much shorter. I'm able to ask myself, why am I choosing this? Why am I feeling it? I accept the moment as it arrives as absolute perfection. And then I make a new choice. Okay. So I don't internalize and store that fear at the level of my subconscious. So it's like a bucket of water filling up in our subconscious with all these fears. And then it tips over, and then we get the acute anxiety attack. So the aim is to see that the fear that you're experiencing is really an illusion. The sports car that you desired is actually not real until you actually have it, okay? But the fear that we experience as a reference point does become real, and we internalize it, even though it's not real. So ultimately, the easiest way to try and overcome this is to go back one step and observe how you are feeling and why you are feeling that way, and understand that it was a choice that you made. So if you and I have a cup of tea and you have a sip of tea from the same cup that I've just had, in a trillion years, we could be sitting around a fire trying to describe what it tastes like to each other. And I'm never going to know what it tastes like to you. I'm not sure if you and I see this jacket as the same color blue. So you have a unique experience. Your choices, you are able to choose what you wish to manifest and create. So Neil Donald Walsh talks about it, where he says that, you know, the opposite of reactive is creative. It's actually the same letters, just spelled differently. So in the moment where you find yourself reacting or reenacting in the same way that you have done previously, in that moment, choose differently and be creative in choosing a different outcome or a different response. And the more you practice this over time, the easier it becomes to manifest any experience that you wish to have in your life.
I like that. Thank you. So, Doctor, I'm sitting and I'm watching this webinar right now, and I've spent my life going to, the typical Western biomedical doctors, but I want to make a change in my life. Where do I start? Where do I start in terms of a healthcare practitioner? Should I go and get my genetics tested? What do I do if I want to take a proactive step into my health and well-being? Into longevity?
So I think the first step, Zoraida, is that, 20 years ago, you could count the number of functional medicine doctors on your hand in South Africa. Right now, there are perhaps maybe a few hundred functional medicine doctors in South Africa that have trained themselves and almost retrained themselves after they left medical school, because it's not offered in any of our medical schools. Yet most of the medical schools internationally offer a speciality in functional medicine, right? So there are many doctors out there and physicians out there who are thinking differently, who have transformed and transcended, or have had a paradigm shift in terms of looking at your health and well-being in a more holistic way. So there are sites where you can go online to find a list of functional medicine doctors. And perhaps maybe the first step is trying to get an idea of what's actually going on in your life with your healthcare. What is your metabolic age or your endocrine age versus your actual age? Are you aging at an age-appropriate rate, and so on? And what are the factors in your environment that are contributing to what you are experiencing? Depending on what they will find with you, okay, you may then go on to more advanced testing in terms of certain genetic testing and more maybe personalized nutritional assessments and so on. And then the approach to managing you is looking at a combination of medication that you may need versus supplementation or an additional supplementation, and all the well-being components or wellness components that may influence you or allow you to get better faster. So that would be the first step. The second step is to then look at these three pillars that I talked about earlier. Do you have inflammation in your body? What is the functional state of your nervous system? And do you have all these hormonal imbalances or deficiencies and excesses? And try and get that balanced. So if we take your nutrition, for example, okay, there are so many different diets and programs out there for people. And one size fits all, or a diet is not the same for everybody. Okay, or a dietary plan, but the concepts behind that are very similar. Okay, so we promote what I would call an anti-inflammatory diet. It means having more omega-3 rich fats in your diet versus and less omega-6, meaning less seed oil such as sunflower oil and canola oil and margarines, and having more grass-fed animal protein rather than grain-fed animal protein. Eating micronutrient-rich fruit and vegetables, going green for the vast majority of time, and limiting the amount of animal protein in our diet to roughly 5 to 10% of our total diet. Okay. Cutting down on the amount of refined sugar and starch in our diet. On the movement side, I like to call it movement rather than exercise, because many people go to a gym and they do high intensity training when they have these imbalances in their body. So if your body is already, or your nervous system is already in a chronically stressed state, and you now go to gym and you do high intensity training, you actually make it worse. So I prefer to talk about movement rather than exercise, and moderate amounts of exercise, perhaps at a slower pace, but for a longer duration of time. And then your physician should be able to get all the hormonal imbalances balanced so that you then feel optimal for your particular age group.
Thank you. I think it's so important that we become active participants in our lives and not be passive anymore and leave everything in the hands of our health practitioners. I think if you keep going to, your doctor and your doctor keeps, prescribing antibiotics and your doctor's not asking you about your environmental determinants in your life or what's happening in your life, I think that's an alarm for you to go, I need to be cognizant of why it is that I keep needing antibiotics as opposed to, keeping on with our prescription all the time. So it's important that we become active in our lives. Doctor, I want to speak to you about, I know that you've got these 4 concepts, which is about nourishment, movement, which you've mentioned now, and I love that. I love movement as opposed to exercise. I love that I appreciate that we're changing our narrative in terms of words these days, because they have a different impact on the way we think about ourselves. So movement is so important because it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to break out in a sweat, but that you get your body moving. So you've got these 4 concepts called nourishment, movement, health, and monitor. Can you tell us more about that? And I also want to link it into where we are today in terms of being human beings in the 21st century, walking around with gadgets that count our steps and check our heart rate. Tell me more about that and your take on it.
So the third component, we talked about nourish and move. The third component is something called heal. which is really looking at all the mindfulness concepts that you could implement in your life to get that nervous system balance. So this would be, for example, breath work and breathing that we know scientifically, gets your body to or your nervous system balance. And you had the talk last week with Dr. Ilamanga, and I mean she's had phenomenal results. And I'm sure, Zoraida, you're busy studying breath work as well, and you know the impact that it does have on people's lives and in terms of their well-being. Some people choose meditation. Some people may choose prayer, okay, in their lives. Other people do yoga. Some people spend time in nature and enjoy and are present to the beauty around them. It's about getting enough sleep and learning to smile more in your life, and all these little things that we can do in our life activates that anti-stress system that I was talking about earlier, and that balances out all the adrenaline and noradrenaline that we've been exposing our bodies to because of all the stressors that we are having or experiencing right now in our environment. On the monitor side, I think this has been accelerated more during this entire COVID crisis, is that many people were afraid to actually go in to see their doctor or go to a hospital because they were afraid of getting sick or getting the infection. We're moving into a period or in our existence in what we call, or into a time of digital superconnectivity or hyperconnectivity, or an age of digital superintelligence or artificial intelligence. I think the world in 5 years' time is going to be a profoundly different place if we think it's different now. So artificial intelligence can already diagnose breast cancer than any radiologist. It can diagnose an MRI scan with a less than 0.5% miss rate compared to 18 or 12 to 18% for radiologists. It can diagnose eye conditions from a picture better than an ophthalmologist. So it's not that it's new or that it's coming, it already exists. Okay. The only problem of why it's not here in a major way is that the connectivity is still too slow with 4G. As soon as we can have faster connectivity, AI is going to play a bigger role and have a bigger impact in terms of our lives. Now, we can fear this future of technology, or you can embrace it and see this as potentially one of the best things or greatest things that could actually ever happen to us as a species. So if a lot of what we do can be performed by an artificially intelligent solution, we may actually have more time on our hands. We may have less stress. We may work less. We may need less of stuff in our life. And we may have the opportunity to be able to actually experience more joy in our life in different forms. So what we've been able to do over the last 5 years is be able to develop various solutions or technology solutions that allow us to give more people access to quality care. Okay? So if you go on our continent of Africa, you're never going to have enough doctors, you're never going to have enough nurses, you can never have enough hospitals. How do we impact 1 billion people on our continent, okay, with using the technology that is currently available and giving them access to best practice or high quality care and access to a well-being model, okay, that allows them to do much better in their lives. And that's what we've been doing. For me, this journey started 5 years ago when I said to myself, look, you can see 10 or 12 patients a day and spend enough time with them, but how do you treat or how do you impact 1 million people a day with the way we understand health and well-being? And that got me started on this journey 5.5 years ago. And we've been able to develop the most amazing and remarkable solutions that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And that's going to be launched shortly, as far as we can get it to go.
Doctor, is that the CardioFit app that you're talking about, or is this something else? Because you're constantly doing something, so I can't keep up with you.
Yeah, well, what we've had to do, Zoraida, is on the technology, we couldn't create little bits and pieces. So we've developed technologies across this care continuum, from the point of screening to diagnosing patients, to engaging with people, to genetic solutions, to analytics behind all this data to make it better. So we've built a number of solutions over the last 5 years, understanding that the entire model of care had to change using technologies and put them into an existing model of how we treat patients. It's not going to work. So this entire corona crisis has probably been the greatest blessing, okay, for us to transform into a model that gives people greater access to care. They could be monitoring themselves at home, okay, and they could have access to a doctor through a virtual consultation. You can get an electronic prescription and so on. So this is where healthcare is moving at a rapid pace globally.
Thank you very much. To wrap up our conversation, my question was going to be, and I'm not too sure if you've answered it because you're excited about what you do. I was going to ask you, what excites you most about the future and well-being as a doctor?
So the technology, that's a great question, Zoraida. So I think, technology is not the answer. It's an enabler to a better future. Okay. I think for me, getting up in the morning, I don't come to work anymore. I come to do something that I love. I've taken the last 20 years, have been the most amazing journey, and a lot of it has actually been influenced by my relationship with my patients. And I think that has actually got me to move in a particular direction to understand how do I give in every moment of my life to my maximum. So every time I meet a patient these days, my first question in my mind is, what gift am I sharing with them today? And I think if you can start that conversation in your mind whenever you meet anyone, not necessarily just a patient, it changes the nature of the interaction, okay? And it becomes a much more meaningful interaction and joyful interaction if you come from a point of giving of your best to everyone that you meet in your life. And I think that's my inspiration of getting up in the morning and doing what we do, is how do I give, okay, or experience the joy of enriching the lives of everyone that we touch.
I love that. That's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. And that makes me think of the word partnership. When you say that you're excited about your patients, it's the symbiotic relationship of a partnership as opposed to a doctor and a patient, or someone higher up and a client. There's a partnership between two people in any environment that you are. Thank you very much, Doctor. This has been enlightening, beautifully enlightening. I've appreciated it. And thank you very much for this series, this SyntroP Wellbeing series that you have initiated. I hope that it long continues after our 6 weeks, which ends next week. I can't believe that it's been 6 weeks, but I hope that in fact, I know that you've got something up your sleeve. You can't not have anything, right? There's something happening after.
Yeah, so the plan is just to thank you, Zoraida, for this evening and for the entire series. Actually, I think you've been absolutely amazing in putting it and holding it all together. Our view is how do we offer a well-being model to everyone out there, okay, that they can use in a very particular way that's relevant in their life. How do we make it more holistic? How do we make it science-based? How do we make it more relevant? And how do we give it away to as many people as possible that don't have access to what we are so privileged and so blessed to have access to in our lives?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us this evening for another edition of the SyntroP Wellbeing series with Dr. Riaz Mutara. We will catch you back again next week, Wednesday at 7:30. Remember, if you have any questions, you can put that on our portals. You can catch us on our social media handles at SyntroP Wellbeing. And from myself, Zoraida Jardine, Dr. Riaz Mutara, thank you very much for tonight. And the rest of the SyntroP Wellbeing peeps, have yourself a good evening. Goodbye. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Zoraida. That was awesome. Bye-bye. We'll chat soon.
Bye.